The federal courtroom was packed beyond capacity as Judge Tanya Chutkin took her seat behind the bench, her black robes flowing as cameras rolled for the historic live broadcast. The tension in the room was electric. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary hearing. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, her navy blazer crisp, hands folded calmly as whispers filled the gallery. Just moments before the hearing began, word had leaked that Judge Chutkin was planning to issue a direct warning to Crockett about her recent statements regarding judicial independence. The media frenzy was instant, phones buzzing, reporters frantically typing, knowing they were about to witness something unprecedented. What happened next shocked everyone in that courtroom, witnesses would later say. Judge Chutkin didn't hold back, but Jasmine's response was something nobody saw coming. The cameras captured every second as Judge Chutkin leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. But what Congresswoman Crockett did next would break the internet within minutes and change how America views political confrontations forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these explosive political moments that are reshaping our nation. Now, let's see exactly what went down in that courtroom. The stage was set for a battle between two of the most powerful women in American politics, one wielding the gavel of justice, the other representing the voice of progressive change. Neither woman was backing down, and the entire country was watching. Judge Chutkin had arrived at the courthouse that morning with a thick folder of printed materials and a stern expression that court staff recognized all too well. She had clearly spent hours preparing for this moment, reviewing every statement Crockett had made about the federal judiciary over the past several weeks. Legal clerks whispered that they had never seen the judge so focused on a single case, so determined to make a point. Meanwhile, Congresswoman Crockett had entered through the courthouse's main entrance, surrounded by a small group of progressive activists who had come to show their support. Despite the crowd of reporters shouting questions, Crockett maintained her composure, offering only a brief statement. "I'm here to have a respectful dialogue about the important issues facing our judicial system." The courtroom itself was a study in contrasts. On one side sat conservative legal scholars and federal prosecutors, many of whom had been calling for someone in authority to address what they saw as dangerous attacks on judicial independence. On the other side, progressive activists, civil rights attorneys, and young lawmakers filled the benches, ready to support their champion in what they viewed as a fight for accountability. Security was unusually tight, with additional federal marshals positioned throughout the courtroom. The unprecedented nature of this confrontation, a sitting federal judge directly challenging a member of Congress in open court, had created concerns about potential disruptions. The gallery was filled to capacity, with an overflow room set up to handle the additional spectators and media personnel. As Judge Chutkin called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel, the room fell into complete silence. Even the court reporter seemed to hold her breath as the judge's eyes swept across the packed courtroom before settling on Congresswoman Crockett. The moment everyone had been waiting for was finally about to begin. Judge Tanya Chutkin had built her reputation as one of the toughest federal judges in the country. Born in Jamaica and raised in Philadelphia, she worked her way through law school and spent decades climbing the judicial ladder. At 62, she commanded respect in every courtroom she entered. Her track record was crystal clear. She didn't play favorites, didn't bend to political pressure, and had zero tolerance for anyone who challenged the authority of the federal court system. Chutkin had been appointed to the federal bench over a decade ago and had presided over some of the most high-profile cases in recent history. She was known for her sharp questioning, her ability to cut through legal nonsense, and most importantly, her fierce protection of judicial independence. Legal experts called her uncompromising and fearless. Defense attorneys respected her fairness, while prosecutors knew she demanded excellence in her courtroom. Her chambers were lined with law books and legal precedents, but what stood out most was a framed copy of the Constitution prominently displayed behind her desk. Colleagues knew that Chutkin viewed herself as a guardian of constitutional principles, particularly the separation of powers that kept the judicial branch independent from political interference. Over the years, she had faced criticism from politicians on both sides of the aisle for various rulings. Conservative lawmakers had attacked her decisions on immigration cases, while progressive politicians had criticized some of her sentencing decisions. But Chutkin had never wavered in her belief that judges should make decisions based on law and precedent, not political pressure. Recent comments from progressive lawmakers had clearly struck a nerve with the judge, and those who knew her well could see the fire in her eyes as she prepared to address what she saw as a direct challenge to the federal court system. She had spent sleepless nights reviewing Crockett's statements, consulting with other federal judges, and preparing what many legal observers expected to be a blistering rebuke. Across the courtroom sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a 43-year-old civil rights attorney who had taken Washington by storm since her election. Growing up in Missouri, Crockett had seen firsthand how the justice system could fail communities of color. She earned her law degree, spent years fighting for the underrepresented, and carried that same fighting spirit into Congress. Crockett's journey to Congress had been anything but typical. As a young attorney, she had taken on police misconduct cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch, representing families who had lost loved ones to excessive force. She had fought for criminal justice reform in state courts across the Midwest, winning cases that established new precedents for police accountability. Her legal background gave her a unique perspective that few members of Congress possessed. While many of her colleagues spoke about judicial issues in abstract terms, Crockett understood the practical impact of court decisions on real people's lives. She had stood in courtrooms defending teenagers facing harsh sentences for minor drug offenses, had argued appeals for wrongfully convicted clients, and had seen how judicial bias could destroy families and communities. When she arrived in Congress, Crockett had quickly become known as one of the most articulate and fearless voices in the progressive movement. Her background as a criminal defense attorney gave her a unique perspective on judicial matters that many of her colleagues lacked. She wasn't afraid to challenge authority, wasn't intimidated by titles or positions, and had built a massive following by speaking truth to power. Over the past month, Crockett had been making headlines with her criticism of certain federal court decisions. She had argued that some judges were making politically motivated rulings, and that Congress had a duty to provide oversight. Her comments had gone viral on social media, with millions of Americans sharing her videos and supporting her stance. Her most controversial statement had come during a late-night interview on a political talk show, where she had said, "The American people deserve to know that their federal judges are making decisions based on law, not politics. When we see patterns of partisan rulings, Congress has not just the right, but the obligation to ask tough questions." The statement had been viewed millions of times online, with supporters praising her courage to speak truth to power, while critics accused her of undermining judicial independence. Legal scholars were divided, with some arguing that she was raising legitimate concerns about judicial accountability, while others insisted that her comments crossed constitutional lines. This wasn't just about two strong women disagreeing. This was about the fundamental balance of power in American democracy. The federal judiciary had always been considered independent from political influence, a sacred principle dating back to the founding of the country. But in an era of increasing polarization, that independence was being questioned like never before. Recent Supreme Court decisions had sparked intense debate about whether federal judges were truly impartial or whether they were influenced by the political preferences of the presidents who appointed them. Statistical analysis had shown clear patterns of partisan voting in federal appeals courts, with judges appointed by Republican presidents consistently ruling differently than those appointed by Democratic presidents on key issues. At the same time, public confidence in the federal judiciary had reached historic lows. Polling data showed that only 25% of Americans had confidence in federal courts, with many citizens expressing belief that judges made decisions based on political considerations rather than legal merit. If Judge Chutkin backed down from confronting Crockett, it could signal that federal judges were afraid of political pressure. If Crockett retreated from her position, it might suggest that Congress had no role in questioning judicial decisions. The outcome of this confrontation would send ripples through every branch of government. Legal experts were calling it a constitutional crisis in the making. Progressive activists saw it as a test of whether their movement could stand up to institutional power. Conservative legal scholars viewed it as a defense of judicial independence. The media recognized it as must-see television. Constitutional law professors across the country had canceled classes to watch the hearing live, understanding that their students were about to witness a real-time civics lesson about separation of powers. Political science textbooks would likely include this moment as an example of institutional tension in American democracy. Every person in that courtroom understood they were witnessing history. The question was, Who would blink first? Judge Chutkin called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. The courtroom fell silent as she surveyed the packed gallery, her eyes eventually settling on Congresswoman Crockett. Without any preliminary remarks, she launched directly into her concerns. Congresswoman Crockett, the judge began, her voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. I want to address some statements you've made recently regarding the federal judiciary, statements that I find deeply troubling. The courtroom tension was instant. Reporters leaned forward, cameras zoomed in on both women, and spectators held their breath. This was happening faster than anyone expected. Crockett remained perfectly still, her expression neutral, hands still folded calmly on the table in front of her. She had clearly prepared for this moment. Your Honor, Crockett responded evenly, I'm here to address any concerns you may have. Judge Chutkin wasn't satisfied with pleasantries. She pulled out a folder thick with printed materials. Clearly, she had done her homework. Last Tuesday, you stated on national television that federal judges are making decisions based on political bias rather than legal precedent. On Friday, you suggested that Congress should consider impeaching judges who make rulings you disagree with. Yesterday, you called the federal court system broken beyond repair. The judge's voice grew stronger with each accusation, and murmurs began rippling through the gallery. Security officers positioned themselves more alertly, sensing the rising tension. These statements, Judge Chutkin continued, represent a dangerous attack on the independence of the federal judiciary. They undermine public confidence in our legal system and suggest that you believe judges should rule based on political pressure rather than the law. Crockett listened without interruption, occasionally nodding slightly to show she was following along. Her calm demeanor was remarkable given the intensity of the accusations being leveled against her. The judge's preparation was evident in every word she spoke. She had clearly spent hours reviewing transcripts, watching video clips, and analyzing Crockett's statements for patterns and themes. Her legal training showed as she methodically built her case against the Congresswoman's recent comments. Furthermore, Judge Chutkin continued, pulling out additional documents from her folder. Your statements have been amplified by social media accounts that regularly attack federal judges by name. Your words have been used to justify threats against federal court personnel. Do you understand the real-world consequences of your rhetoric? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Progressive activists in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, while conservative legal observers nodded in agreement with the judge's concerns. Judge Chutkin wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Crockett's face. Furthermore, Congresswoman, your comments suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of the separation of powers. Federal judges are appointed for life precisely so they can make difficult decisions without fear of political retaliation. When you suggest otherwise, you're attacking one of the foundational principles of American democracy. The progressive activists in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. They had come to support Crockett, but the judge's words carried undeniable authority. Conservative legal observers nodded in agreement, sensing validation of their concerns about progressive overreach. Crockett finally spoke, her voice steady and clear. Your Honor, may I respond to these concerns? You may, Judge Chutkin replied curtly, but I want you to understand the gravity of this situation. Your words have consequences, Congresswoman. They influence public opinion and can damage institutions that have served this country for over 2 centuries. The judge's tone had grown more serious with each exchange. What had started as a formal judicial proceeding was becoming something more personal, more intense. The packed courtroom could sense that this was building toward a climactic moment. Judge Chutkin pulled out what appeared to be a thick legal brief from her folder. I have here a compilation of social media posts, news articles, and public statements that directly quote your comments about federal judges. Some of these posts include personal information about judges and their families. Others contain explicit threats of violence. She held up the document so the courtroom could see its thickness. This is what happens when elected officials make irresponsible statements about the judiciary. You may not have intended these consequences, but you cannot escape responsibility for them. The accusation was devastating. Crockett's supporters in the gallery looked stunned, while her critics appeared vindicated. The suggestion that her words had contributed to threats against judges and their families was the most serious charge yet leveled against her. The judge continued her pointed questioning, and the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly charged. Legal experts in the gallery were frantically taking notes, understanding they were witnessing a historic confrontation between the legislative and judicial branches. "Do you believe, Congresswoman Crockett, that federal judges should make decisions based on what's popular with the public?" Judge Chutkin asked, her tone suggesting she already knew she wouldn't like the answer. "Or perhaps you think judges should rule based on what members of Congress prefer?" she continued, "because that seems to be what your recent statements suggest." The questions came rapid fire now, each one designed to corner Crockett into admitting either that she had overstepped her bounds, or that she fundamentally misunderstood the role of the judiciary. But Crockett remained unflappable. She listened to each question, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad, but never appearing flustered or defensive. Her legal training was showing. She knew how to handle hostile questioning. The tension in the courtroom was becoming palpable. Reporters were typing furiously, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would dominate headlines for days. The progressive activists who had come to support Crockett looked increasingly worried, while conservative legal scholars appeared to be enjoying the spectacle of a progressive politician being held accountable. Judge Chutkin's voice rose slightly as she delivered what seemed designed to be the knockout blow. "Congresswoman, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your recent statements border on contempt for the federal court system. They suggest that you believe political pressure should influence judicial decisions. This is antithetical to everything our legal system stands for." The courtroom was dead silent. Every person present understood they were witnessing the climax of this confrontation. The judge had laid down her challenge in the strongest possible terms. "I want you to think very carefully about your next words," Judge Chutkin continued, "because they will be heard not just by the people in this courtroom, but by judges, lawyers, and citizens across the country. How do you justify your attacks on judicial independence?" This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge had delivered her warning with maximum force and authority. Now it was Crockett's turn to respond, and her answer would determine whether this confrontation escalated further or found some resolution. The cameras captured every micro-expression as Congresswoman Crockett slowly stood up, adjusted her blazer, and prepared to deliver her response to one of the most powerful judges in America. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that the whirring of the television cameras seemed unusually loud. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat with deliberate composure, her movements measured and confident. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Judge Chutkin sat back slightly, clearly expecting either a confrontation or an apology. What happened next would become the most watched courtroom moment in recent political history. "Your Honor," Crockett began, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom with crystal clarity, "I appreciate your concerns, and I respect the institution you represent. But I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my statements and my intentions." Judge Chutkin's eyebrows raised slightly, but she remained silent, waiting to see where this was heading. Crockett pulled out her own folder. She had clearly come prepared for this exact confrontation. "Your Honor, with respect, I believe my statements have been taken out of context. When I spoke about political bias in the judiciary, I was referring to documented patterns in judicial appointments and the clear ideological divides that have emerged in recent years. This isn't an attack on judicial independence. It's an acknowledgement of reality that legal scholars across the political spectrum have documented." She opened her folder and pulled out the first document. According to research from the National Law Journal, federal appeals courts now show clear patterns of partisan voting along party lines of the president who appointed them. When I point this out, I'm not attacking the judiciary. I'm calling for transparency about a system that claims to be above politics, but increasingly appears to be influenced by it. The courtroom stirred. This wasn't the defensive response anyone expected. Crockett was going on offense with facts and research. Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength and confidence with each word. "Your Honor, I've spent my entire legal career in courtrooms. I've seen how judicial decisions affect real people's lives. When I critique certain patterns in federal court rulings, I'm not attacking individual judges or the institution itself. I'm advocating for the people who depend on our courts to deliver fair and impartial justice." She pulled out another document, this one appearing to be a statistical analysis. This study from the American Bar Association shows that public confidence in federal courts has declined by 40% over the past decade. This erosion of trust isn't happening because members of Congress are asking questions. It's happening because ordinary Americans see a system that seems disconnected from their experiences and concerns. Judge Chutkin shifted in her chair, clearly not expecting such a prepared and substantive response. But Crockett wasn't finished. "Furthermore, Your Honor, when I discussed congressional oversight of the judiciary, I was referring to the constitutional responsibility that Congress has always had. Article 3 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to establish courts, set jurisdictions, and yes, to impeach judges for high crimes and misdemeanors. This isn't a radical position, it's constitutional law." She pulled out another document, this one appearing to be from a legal textbook. Chief Justice John Marshall himself acknowledged in Marbury v. Madison that while the judiciary interprets the law, it's not above accountability to the other branches of government. When I suggest that Congress should exercise oversight, I'm advocating for the balance of powers that the founders intended. The progressive activists in the gallery began to sit up straighter. Their congresswoman wasn't backing down. She was making her case with legal precision. Crockett then addressed the most serious charge that had been leveled against her. "Your Honor, you mentioned that my statements have been associated with threats against federal judges and their families. I want to be absolutely clear about this. I categorically condemn any threats of violence against judges, court personnel, or their families. Such behavior is unacceptable and has no place in our democracy." Her voice took on a more personal tone, but remained respectfully firm. "However, I cannot accept responsibility for how others might misinterpret or misuse my words. Every member of Congress faces the same challenge. We speak about important issues, knowing that some individuals might take our words in directions we never intended. The solution cannot be to stop discussing important constitutional questions." But Crockett's most powerful moment was yet to come. She looked directly at Judge Chutkin, her voice remaining respectfully firm. "Your Honor, I want to address your concern about undermining public confidence in the judicial system. With respect, public confidence in the federal judiciary is already at historic lows. According to recent polling, only 25% of Americans have confidence in the federal courts, the lowest level ever recorded." She paused, letting that statistic sink in. This loss of confidence isn't because members of Congress are asking tough questions. It's because ordinary Americans see a system that seems increasingly disconnected from their daily lives and struggles. When federal judges make decisions that affect millions of people, those people have a right to understand the reasoning, and their elected representatives have a right to ask questions. Judge Chutkin's expression had changed. The confident authority she had displayed earlier was now mixed with something else, perhaps recognition that Crockett had a point. Crockett stepped slightly closer to the bench, her voice taking on a more personal tone while remaining respectful. "Your Honor, I didn't become a lawyer, and I didn't run for Congress to attack our institutions. I did it to make them work better for the people they're supposed to serve. When I see federal court decisions that seem to ignore the real-world impact on working families, on communities of color, on people struggling to make ends meet, I don't think the appropriate response is silence." She gestured toward the packed gallery. "These people, the American people, they deserve to have their elected representatives advocate for them, even when that advocacy means asking uncomfortable questions about powerful institutions." Then Crockett did something that caught everyone off guard. Instead of continuing her defense, she pivoted to a question for the judge. "Your Honor, may I ask you something? Do you believe that the federal judiciary is perfect? Do you believe that no federal judge has ever made a decision influenced by personal or political bias? Do you believe that the system is working as well as it possibly could for all Americans?" The courtroom was stunned. No one challenges a federal judge with direct questions during a hearing. But Crockett had done it so respectfully, so thoughtfully, that even Judge Chutkin seemed taken aback. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Judge Chutkin sat quietly, clearly processing what she had just heard. The angry authority from earlier had given way to something more thoughtful, more nuanced. "Congresswoman, she finally said, her voice notably softer than before. "You make some valid points about constitutional responsibilities and the current state of public confidence in the judiciary." The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. The judge was actually engaging with Crockett's arguments rather than simply dismissing them. "However," Judge Chutkin continued, "I still believe that the way concerns are raised matters tremendously. The language used, the forum chosen, the tone taken, all of these things affect how the message is received and whether it helps or hurts the cause of justice." Crockett nodded thoughtfully. "Your Honor, I absolutely agree with that point. If my language has been interpreted as disrespectful to the institution of the judiciary, that was not my intention, and I'm willing to be more careful about how I express these concerns going forward." The courtroom buzz grew louder. This was not the confrontation anyone had expected. Instead of a battle, they were witnessing two intelligent, principled women finding common ground on a complex issue. But the moment that would break the internet came next. Judge Chutkin leaned forward slightly and said, "Congresswoman Crockett, I want to thank you for your thoughtful response today. You've reminded me that even federal judges need to listen carefully to criticism and consider whether changes might be needed in how we operate." Then she added the line that would be shared millions of times. "Perhaps we both serve the cause of justice better when we challenge each other, respectfully, rather than simply defending our positions." The courtroom erupted in surprised applause. Even the bailiffs seemed caught off guard by the sudden shift from confrontation to mutual respect. Crockett smiled genuinely for the first time during the hearing. "Thank you, Your Honor. I believe that respectful dialogue between our institutions is exactly what the American people deserve." Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, clips of Jasmine Crockett's response were spreading across social media like wildfire. The hashtag #Crockett response began trending nationally before the participants had even left the courthouse. The most shared clip showed the moment when Crockett asked Judge Chutkin whether the judiciary was perfect, followed by the judge's surprisingly thoughtful response. Users across the political spectrum were sharing the video with captions like, "This is how political disagreements should be handled," and "respectful but firm, exactly what we need more of." Progressive accounts were celebrating Crockett's performance as a masterclass in standing firm while remaining respectful. Conservative legal experts, surprisingly, were also praising her approach, noting that she had raised legitimate constitutional questions without resorting to personal attacks or inflammatory rhetoric. One viral tweet read, "Jasmine Crockett just showed everyone how to challenge authority without losing your dignity or your argument. This is leadership." The tweet was shared over 50,000 times within 2 hours. The video clips were being dissected frame by frame on political talk shows and social media platforms. Communication experts pointed out specific moments where Crockett's body language, tone, and word choice had shifted the dynamic from confrontational to collaborative. Political science professors were already incorporating the exchange into their curricula as an example of effective political communication. Legal commentators were having a field day analyzing what had just occurred. Constitutional law professors noted that Crockett had demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of separation of powers while making her case for congressional oversight. Political analysts pointed out that her calm, prepared response had likely enhanced her national profile significantly. Instead of being seen as a firebrand making reckless attacks on the judiciary, she was now being viewed as a thoughtful lawmaker capable of engaging with complex institutional questions. Even typically critical conservative media outlets were grudgingly admitting that Crockett had handled herself well. One prominent legal blogger wrote, "I disagree with many of Congresswoman Crockett's policy positions, but her performance today showed exactly the kind of respectful but principled engagement our political system needs more of." Perhaps most surprisingly, Judge Chutkin's post-hearing comments to reporters were remarkably positive. Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated today that it's possible to raise serious questions about judicial operations while maintaining respect for the institution, she said. "That's the kind of dialogue that strengthens our democracy rather than weakening it." Legal experts noted that federal judges rarely make such positive public comments about politicians who have criticized the courts. The judge's response was being seen as an acknowledgement that Crockett had found the right tone for raising difficult questions. The hearing's outcome had immediate political implications. Progressive activists, who had been worried that their movement was becoming too confrontational, now had an example of how to be firm without being destructive. Crockett's approach was being studied as a model for future interactions between progressive lawmakers and institutional authorities. Moderate Democrats, who had been concerned about the party's relationship with the federal judiciary, were pointing to Crockett's performance as evidence that the party could address systemic issues without attacking democratic institutions themselves. Even some Republicans privately admitted that Crockett had raised valid points about judicial transparency and accountability, though they were unlikely to say so publicly. Political scientists began analyzing the hearing as a potential turning point in how political confrontations are conducted. The fact that both women had found common ground while maintaining their principles was being held up as a model for political engagement in an era of extreme polarization. Communication experts noted that Crockett's success came from three key factors: thorough preparation, respectful tone, and willingness to acknowledge valid points from the other side. These elements, they argued, could be applied to political disagreements across the spectrum. The hearing had clearly elevated Jasmine Crockett's national profile significantly. Political strategists were already speculating about her potential for higher office, noting that her performance had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership qualities that voters say they want to see more of. Fundraising reports showed that Crockett's campaign account received thousands of small donations in the hours following the hearing, indicating broad grassroots support for her approach. Progressive organizations were already reaching out about potential speaking engagements and endorsement opportunities. The hearing had essentially served as a national audition for leadership within the Democratic Party. Perhaps most importantly, the hearing had started conversations about actual reforms to improve judicial transparency and accountability. Legal experts were discussing specific changes that could address some of the concerns Crockett had raised while preserving judicial independence. Some federal courts announced they would begin publishing more detailed explanations of their decision-making processes. Others indicated they would expand public access to court proceedings and documents. The National Association of Federal Judges issued a statement saying they would be reviewing current practices to ensure they were maintaining appropriate transparency while preserving independence. As political commentators analyzed the day's events, a clear theme emerged. Confrontation doesn't have to mean destruction. Crockett had proven that it's possible to challenge powerful institutions while actually strengthening democratic discourse. The hearing was being studied in political science classes as an example of effective political communication. The key elements, preparation, respect, principled firmness, and willingness to find common ground, were being held up as a model for political engagement. The success of Crockett's approach raised questions about whether other political figures would adopt similar strategies. Early indicators suggested that several lawmakers from both parties were studying her performance and considering how to apply similar approaches to their own institutional challenges. What had started as a potential constitutional crisis had instead become a model for democratic engagement. Judge Chutkin's warning had been met with Crockett's calm, prepared response, and both women had emerged with enhanced reputations. The American people had witnessed two strong leaders disagree respectfully and find common ground without compromising their principles. In an era of extreme political polarization, that alone was remarkable. The story of Judge Chutkin's warning and Jasmine Crockett's response became more than just a viral moment. It became a template for how democratic institutions can challenge each other constructively rather than destructively. As the dust settled on this remarkable political moment, one thing was clear. Jasmine Crockett had not just defended her position or avoided a confrontation. She had set a new standard for how political leaders can engage with institutional authority, firmly but respectfully, substantively but constructively. Her calm response to Judge Chutkin's warning had gone viral not just because it was dramatic, but because it represented something Americans rarely see anymore: principled political leadership that brings out the best in our democratic institutions rather than tearing them down. The question now was whether other political leaders would follow her example, or whether this would remain a rare moment of political excellence in an otherwise polarized era. If you found this incredible story as compelling as millions of other Americans did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to stay updated on all the political moments that are reshaping our democracy. Which political leader do you think should follow Jasmine Crockett's example of respectful but firm engagement? Let us know in the comments below. and we'll see you in the next story where we explore who might be the next political figure to master this approach to democratic leadership.